Welcome back to Domino Theory, the podcast about media, politics, and business. I'm Chrisitan Whiton, joined as always by co-host Mark Simon. I'm coming to you today from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Mark is in Florida today, and our guest Steve Yates joins us from Buenos Aires. Mark and Steve, please say hello.
Hi there. Great to be with you.
All right. Well, another fun week in Washington coming to an end. This one had the non-State of the Union, State of the Union. So that's the first address the president gives in his new term. You don't call it the State of the Union, I guess, because he hasn't been president long enough to really opine on the State of the Union, but opine away Trump did. And he packed enough information into that hearing that I think it's probably more content rich than any State of the Union, at least anyone that I can remember. Certainly went on for a long time, 2 hours. And a lot of people are focused, of course, on the macro politics, whether Trump is winning, how he's doing with popular support, what DOGE is accomplishing, what the Democrats refuse to stand up for, including a 13-year-old cancer survivor, and sort of the big politics. I'd like to jump into an area that I think is just below the surface, that does have a lot of policy activity, but we're not seeing it because there's so much going on in Ukraine, and there's so much going on with eliminating DEI, and there's so much going on domestically, but that's East Asia. And Trump actually has put not insignificant tariffs on China, and this is on top of tariffs that both he and President Biden had on China to start off with, 20%, and the prospect that those tariffs may be going higher. You have a government there with Xi Jinping that, unlike Canada and unlike Mexico and unlike others who have been threatened with tariffs, actually isn't backing down, perhaps because his political system doesn't let him back down. And we also had this week a hearing on the Hill. It didn't get too much in terms of headlines, but significant nonetheless. It was for the Undersecretary of Defense for Political Affairs. The nominee is Elbridge Colby. A lot of talk about Taiwan. Of course, both of you have extensive experience with business and policy in Taiwan. But one quote that came out of it, this is from Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, and they're talking about how Taiwan has said it's going to increase its defense spending, but has a legislative yuan, its legislative branch, that's actually cut its defense budget, which can't sit well with Donald Trump. And here's what Sullivan said to Bridge. He said, okay, good. Let me go back to Taiwan very briefly. I would agree, and you talked about it earlier, it is the KMT, and it is the KMT, by the way. They control the legislature. It's different from the president's party. They're playing a dangerous game on their defense budget. And if anyone from Taiwan is watching this hearing, they need to realize they are playing a dangerous game, okay? Cutting defense spending right now is not the right signal. We all agree on that. So, Steve, with that preface, do you think, would you agree with what I'm saying, that Asia policy, even though it isn't getting headlines, is going to change dramatically, and Trump is going to approach this very, very differently than his predecessor, and very differently than, frankly, they did in the first Trump administration?
Well, definitely there are some adjustments coming. Now, some of them were foreshadowed in Trump 1.0. And it's hard to say what was done during the Biden administration because the president himself did almost nothing. There were some statements. And when it came to Taiwan, President Biden was famous for spouting off about an unequivocal commitment to defend Taiwan if it were attacked. And every single time, usually to the Financial Times, a senior White House official would walk back that statement into the warm, trodden phrases that go back to the 70s. And all that's kind of familiar territory, but really it was kind of a treading water period. And the Biden administration was filled with people who made a name for themselves talking about a pivot to Asia in the Obama administration under Secretary Clinton. And, a decade and a half later, that hadn't really materialized in a fundamental way. But they would occasionally say the right things to the right people, and meetings would be fine. And when you're dealing foreign ministry to State Department, a meeting is the objective. And so they had a fair amount of that in the Biden administration. The Trump administration isn't even in place yet, really, in a meaningful way to manage relations with Asia. You don't have the top tier ambassadors in place. You don't have an assistant secretary of state in place or an undersecretary of state for policy yet confirmed. And so you don't have some of those kind of key nodes that are active and doing things. But there's been some big things on Asia. I would argue the two most important visits to the White House so far were Japan and India. Yes, there have been others, and other topics have been covered. And who could ever forget Vladimir Zelensky coming? That tended to make a little bit of news and notice and policy. But really, the Japan visit and India visit were early, were very substantial in the broad range of issues covered. And for the bare bones staffing in the White House and across agencies, a lot of that stuff was hammered out. It almost makes you wonder whether we should have all these other people working in the government that lard up these statements over time. But I guess if you focus on the Taiwan part that you were framing, there are a couple of pieces of this that are at play at the same time. Number one is the argument that's frequently attributed to Elbridge Colby, and I think he may have said some of the things along these lines in the hearing, where Taiwan needs to increase its defense spending to a substantially high percentage, and that there would be a notion of rebalancing America's forces so that there was a concentration in Asia, and that's why allies in other regions needed to increase their share of burdens so that America could concentrate elsewhere for the challenge of China. And then you had Sullivan emphasizing, well, there is divided politics in Taiwan, and we've seen this movie before. We lived through it in the Bush administration, and 20 years later, there's this push for military purchases and a divided government where the DPP is in the presidential office and the KMT controls the legislature. All that's useful. The part that didn't come out in that hearing that is also very critical is that the United States itself is very far behind in delivering things that have already been committed to and already been paid for, years behind. And so while there's, I think, an element of truth in all three sides of this, the Sullivan point, really important to put the rubber on the road in Taiwan where the obstruction is. That was different. It hasn't been often done. Very important that Taiwan does more, but in some ways it's been inching at least in the right direction, but no focus on the role that Bridge and others of the Pentagon have to play together with DOGE to make it so that America goes back to manufacturing things on time and at cost and actually deliver them to paying allies so that they deter things themselves and America doesn't have to come in to intervene. That's the part that was missing to me in that exchange. 2 parts good, 1 part AWOL.
Right.
In Taiwan, nobody really trusts Colby. In Asia, the Japanese aren't not even too crazy about him. I can say that up front. They view his views on Ukraine, that once Ukraine's solved, he will just transfer those views over to Asia. The belief that they have is, from a lot of people out there, is that essentially he says this because that's what he thinks the MAGA base wants to hear. In other words, it's not very principled is the idea. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. I've only met the guy once or twice, never had a substantial conversation with him. I think a lot of the things that he said were self-evident, though. In other words, I think one of the things I really like about Trump is he's kind of the guy who's kicking the kid out of the house. You know what I'm saying? It's like, launch when ready. And, magically what's happening is people are waking up. The problem with the Taiwanese is they're not waking up in many ways. In other words, they really are consumed internally. And they're doing everything they can, in my mind, at times to move around, to just play around it. Now, I know there's some excellent people over there. The majority are pretty good. But, for example, it is a KMT issue. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you've heard of him, Steve, Fu Kunchi, the legislative whip over there. This guy's a gangster. He's a KMT guy. He spends so much time in China. And really the Biden administration refused to call him out. I had this very animated discussion with the State Department person. Well, why are you treating these guys normally? In other words, if this guy was from Mexico, we would not have him into the White House. But magically, our AIT under the Biden administration was courting these people. And I firmly believe, after being around the KMT, knowing them, playing poker with a few of their people, the fact of the matter is, I think that they are firmly in the Chinese camp. Feel free to disagree with me. I think that's where they see their bread being buttered. And I think there's no downside for it. So I think it's going to be the problem they have is you now have a Trump. And in fairness to Elbridge Colby, I think he called him out. The other thing, too, I agree with Steve on, look, the Americans, it's a very strong comeback they have to the U.S. that you haven't delivered these weapons. I think the funniest thing I find out about that is that essentially who didn't deliver the weapons? And I think Trump will deliver weapons much more forcefully. I think it'll be much faster. It's one of my disagreements with the Ukrainians. I know it's lovely to have the Ukrainians all the stuff they want in some world, but the fact is we need HIMARS in Taiwan, we need them in the Philippines, and I would say our economic interest and our national security interest in Asia outweigh anything in Ukraine by a mile. And I think really when we look at Taiwan, Kristen, my one thing is then it always comes down to this. I'm hoping we can get somebody that they send over there for AIT who's going to speak more bluntly to the Taiwanese. And I hope somebody in this administration is much more blunt with them in the terms and more public with the Taiwanese people about what make your choice. Make your choice about what you're going to do. I think the Taiwanese are have really picked it up in the last few years, and I think the one place that's really impressed me when it comes to Taiwan is Japan. I'm 100% sold that the Japanese fight, largely because I don't think any Chinese military commander is going to leave those Southern Kuril Islands. Oh, I forget the two names. Those two military bases and Okinawa. Who's going to leave those untested? There's no way. So we're in my mind. Chinese attack. Who's kidding who? We're in.
Well, Steve, what do you think about that? I guess the political scenario before the military one, because I do wonder if the Chinese would try and construct some sort of attack very carefully so it doesn't draw in Japan or hit our bases at Okinawa and present us something where we'd have to respond, at least in some part. But what Bridge, I think, was getting at, which upset some senators, at least in advance. I think I don't think he'll have a problem. I could be wrong. We'll see how the vote comes out. But the hearing seemed to go fine. But the idea that finally, even though Obama said we were doing this with a rebalancing, which followed a pivot to Asia, which didn't actually happen, and then that was sort of the de facto policy under Trump and Biden. But the idea that you're going to pull back on Europe and you're going to pull back on Middle East backwaters and you're certainly going to pull back on nation building. And the idea is then you can actually constitute a military that's better prepared. And that seemed to come across from senators of both parties, this acknowledgement that we're not ready for a fight and that in fact is encouraging aggression against Taiwan. Do you think that this and then there's one other, I guess, rumor, which is that the Secretary of Defense Hegseth has said to various departments within the department, many departments over there, it's a very complicated bureaucracy, but to come up with 8% cuts in order to fund Trump priorities. There's some talk that the initial priority will be Iron Dome for the United States, which is a lot like Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. But the idea that you actually could get a military that's better prepared to deter war with China, do you think that's an inference we can make from where the Bridge hearing and where Trump is going, or is it just too early to tell?
Well, of course, with everything, it's going to be too early to tell just because we have a lot of these marbles that still have to bounce into each other and see how they ricochet. And that's part of that's going to be personnel. Do they actually fit in their ecosystems and function in their jobs? We have people who are being promoted more than a couple of rungs above the usual personnel ladder. And so they may fly or they may fall. We don't know how that's all going to play out. And there's things happening in the world. I mean, there's a lot of dominant variables in these equations that are not in the United States. There's moving parts that are decidedly affecting the direction of our interests and our allies' interests that are not us. And when it comes to what people call the Indo-Pacific, I still want to call it Asia, is that the dominant variable in that is really China, and it's Xi Jinping that has been pushing things. I could be wrong about this. I don't think China has any intention whatsoever in fighting a conventional war. And if you look at the history of the People's Republic of China, they absolutely suck at conventional war. They are good at unconventional war. They're good at murdering people. They're good at poisoning people. They're good at polluting people's minds. They've also practiced extremely heavily without any form of ethics on cyber and other forms of attack. I would expect that what we're going to be up against is a war like no other. And if China seeks to move against Taiwan, there's going to be biological, cyber, infrastructure, all kinds of crazy crap happening in the United States, Japan, if it dares to get involved. But I agree with Mark, though, that I think that they're lined up to do something, and that China would rue the day that they awaken a normalized, powerful Japan. So I just think that we're dealing with probably drone swarms and iron domes, space-based assets, things that are happening in country. If there's going to be survivability and resilience for that first island chain, they're going to have to be able to do things inside China that make things chaotic and difficult to change options inside China. If they're going to survive, they can't just have a war of attrition like Ukraine has absorbed wave after wave from Russia. They can't absorb wave after wave from China. And so I think all the decisions are going to be different. Now, I don't think it's going to come down to how many aircraft carriers we have and can we produce a lot of the most advanced fighter jets. I love those things. I'd love to have more of those things. I think it's going to come down to the computer geeks and a lot of this new lighter hardware that does complicated and terrifying things in different ways. So in that sense, the Taiwanese can catch up, the Japanese can catch up, and Americans can catch up if we invest smarter in ways. We got to keep traditional hard power just because I think there is still staying value in that. But it's this other frontier that I expect the Communist Party to fight with. Frankly, I expect a lot of their expensive platforms to come out in high quantity and crash and burn very, very quickly, if ever used. But they got a lot of it.
Steve, let me ask you a question. If you had to go to, President Lee right now and say, look, here are the two things. I never like one thing. Well, here are the two things that we in the U.S. need you to do. What would you tell him?
For President Lai in Taiwan?
Yeah, what would you say? Here's the two things we need you to do.
Well, in some ways, I think they're moving in this direction. Anyway, I mean, one is you have got to make a broader strategic economic bond with the countries that really will do something that matters to you. So stop playing to the international globalist movement and begging to get into meetings that will never save your bacon. Focus much, much more heavily on strategic economic relationships, whether it's co-production, co-investment with Japan, Philippines, United States, that are going to affect your near abroad and affect your resiliency in a time of crisis. Lash your energy dependency on the great state of Alaska, not imports from the Middle East, and learn to love nuclear again. But that broader strategic economic relationship with the United States, Japan, and I throw the Philippines in there anyway, because why not? They're in the conversation at this point. The other thing, when it comes to the military, my advice to them was go big. Offer to buy the biggest, most expensive things that you reasonably could want, put to use, what have you. And if others say no, have them negotiate you back to what they can and will provide and work with that. But basically take this bumper sticker away that you're not willing to invest and do things to defend yourself. Those are the two big things. In my view, I don't think those are novel observations. I don't think they're even, I think a lot of people have said things along these lines, and I think that there's been a debate and somewhat movement along these lines. But the divided politics muffles the message and it gets in the way of follow through. And there's nothing I can say to the elected president of Taiwan about how to navigate the politics of Taiwan. It's a crazy system to aliens from outside. And, to have a presidential office, to have a premier running an executive yuan that takes questions in front of the legislature. The legislature itself is not like our Congress. It operates differently. That stuff is kind of impenetrable. The only thing you can do on that front is win, but hopefully win on things that will be attractive to those you really need to depend upon. And this is the part where I would just, punctuate something that I know Christian and I have tried to bang the gong about for years. They have too many people in their politics that want to play nice with other countries' flags in their bios and multiple pronouns in their bios and all kinds of other global issues. And literally none of these constituencies will deter Beijing or protect Taiwan or even welcome their elected leaders to come to their meetings. And so double down with those who will give you the time of day if you're serious about real economic growth and leadership and real defense with a real free world. But you asked for two, you got way more than two. But I'm like,
no. I mean, look, I'm with you. So much of the Taiwanese is, and when I see the Taiwanese, I'm there, and I always just tell people, you'd go, and they're so desperate for interaction that sometimes you just, you look at them. If we all remember Gary Schmidt, he and I were walking up to the Sherwood Hotel one time, and we saw all the flags from the countries that recognized them. And I'm going, it looks like they got the flags from the Star Wars movie or something like that. Because, we're two pretty well-traveled guys, and we're going like, what country is that? I mean, that's a country, and you learn that very quickly. And the Taiwanese are consistently, soliciting that. The other thing too is that I do think your point is very correct. They just need to buy weapons, and I think, and they need to stop playing around, in terms of like always trying, like they're not going to get the F-35. Stop it, okay? But there's a lot of other stuff that they can get. Now there's a lot of other things they can buy. They can buy things the Americans want to send to them fairly quickly. But that brings me back to the KMT. What do you think of these recall movements? How do you think that's going to play? Because I think it looks like, I had just by chance was talking to a DPP Politico last night, just quickly about something else. And then we touched on this. He thinks the KMT guy is going to be completely unsuccessful pulling the DPP people back. But it looks like the DPP is going to recall some of these KMT legislators. What's your take on that?
Well, just as a recovering addict of politics, I'm not a super fan of recalls. They tend not to draw a very high percentage in terms of voter participation. And so just in terms of representative government, I think it's not the best tool in the democracy arsenal. But occasionally it's necessary if you have people who are engaged in criminal behavior, if there are things that are, euphemistically unpatriotic, borderline treasonous. There are going to be needs to do that. But I don't like recalls as a remedy for your party sucks and I want to take the seat away from you, even though I have some empathy for that. I mean, there are several seats in the state of California that went one way on election night and 3 weeks later start one by one falling like dominoes in another direction. I would love it if there was some scrutiny on those processes and maybe recall what I think were illegitimate processes. In the Taiwan case, I just strongly feel like they need, as major parties, to focus as hard as possible on doing some of the things that Trump and the MAGA movement have done. They don't have to echo those policies or language or tactics, but just take for example, almost every core element of Trump's address to Congress was a framing from a communications point of view of an 80-20 issue, where Trump is on the 80% side of that issue. And it forced the Democrats to sit on their hands and sort of fart in public because they're on the 20% and they got to sit there and smell their fart. And this is all deliberate, picking issue after issue. Where's the 80%? And I'm here. And just make it painful to the point of self-marginalization for the opposition, to the point where you're in a much better position going into legislative elections to change your proportional representation in the legislature, etc. So in Taiwan, what are those 80-20 issues? Well, in times past, there was this issue of identity. Are you Taiwanese or what have you? And the opposition movement kind of rode that change of perception to a majority in the legislature. But then they sort of lost what their identity was. Are we anti-nuclear? Are we about cutting carbon out of our lives?
Transvestite boxers.
Yeah, I'm a fan of tolerance, but having the region's largest pride parade doesn't kind of change the fundamentals of your next election's politics in Taiwan. So what are those 80-20 issues, or even 70-30 issues, whatever they are, and focus on that? And there's some we've talked about over the years. Where is there genuinely a voice of pro-business policy in Taiwan, or pro-capitalist policy in Taiwan? Where is there a rational debate about immigration and real workforce development in Taiwan? So there's some real bread and butter building blocks of politics issues that are not defined in that system. I think that the major parties should be really drilling down into their identity on those policy agendas that create the definition, instead of these recalls and sort of this overbearing personalization of politics, which is addictive, but it doesn't lead to results. And a lot of the world thinks that Trump is all just about personality, and it's hard to deny. There's definitely some of that personality, but the genius in it, in my view, is that on policy, there are some big things that with all this distraction are moving forward. It's not perfect, but it's way more progress than I witnessed in the Reagan administration or both Bush administrations.
No, I have to tell you, I mean, I fully agree. One of the biggest frustration that I bump into, and I think Kristen, and I can bring Kristen, Kristen, it's like when you're trying to give people in Taiwan advice on what to do. I mean, what do you bump into all the time over there, in terms of that? I mean, what do you see as the problems that they can overcome? They need to overcome.
Right. I think some of it is what Steve and you have talked about before, which is these things that I don't think were, frankly, that effective even in Joe Biden's Washington. I mentioned the transvestite boxer. I mean, the idea that they sent American-made F-16s to welcome home a 777 flying a woman athlete who won the gold in boxing. Well, it turns out that person actually is biologically male, or maybe. So what was it? A gold medal in domestic abuse? And you think that's an obscure issue, but Donald Trump has demonstrated repeatedly that he is aware of this and not happy about it. He is someone who follows boxing and follows sports. And then it's the issue of TSMC, and they think that semiconductors will be their, I don't know if you want to call it a get out of jail free card or a Trump card. And they just did announce a $100 billion investment supposedly by TSMC in the U.S. There is, I think, bitterness from the first Trump administration, from when Terry Guo, talk about your KMT guy, went to the White House and promised an iPhone factory in Wisconsin. And I'm pretty sure that is still a field of weeds. So you have, this belief in things rather than some sort of emotional tug or demonstration that they're willing to be an asset and that can be useful against China, that they can actually put the lie to the whole reason the CCP has for existing, which is if you don't have the CCP, you have chaos. Well, Taiwan proves you can have an ethnically Chinese majority country and have democracy, and it is a little chaotic, but it's better than the KMT. But that leads to a question for both of you. But actually, Mark, you were in shipping before you were in media, and one thing we've heard, and I think this is implicit, a little bit of concern with Bridge, but I don't think it's pertaining to him. I think he's just sort of stating or implying what a lot of us are thinking, and you see this in some of the things Michael Anton over at State Policy Planning has said, which is just pointing out the vulnerability of our aircraft carriers, the idea that that'll prevent that, one or two or surging three carriers, or how you would deter or handle a Chinese attack. Steve, as you mentioned, the attack would probably be very different than that. It would be hybrid in nature. But I think there's this undertone that the balance of power has shifted so much that, of course, we're never going to say publicly that we're going to give up Taiwan, or that we'll have no ability to undo a Chinese blockade. But the reality is that the line of defense runs from our treaty allies, Japan, through the Philippines, and through Southeast Asia, and that we are, in fact, prepared to lose Taiwan. But Mark, I think you pointed out, just based on your knowledge of shipping, and in addition to politics and national security, that would be pretty untenable for the United States in East Asia. Is that right? And why do you think it is?
Well, I mean, look, I'll go back to this years and years ago, about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I heard this story about it. There's a dinner in Canberra, and the Australians were down there, and the military attaches are there. And the Chinese, one of the junior Chinese military attaches, maybe had a little bit much to drink, but he was telling the Australians, don't worry, when you go over the South China Sea, which is our lake, we'll let you fly over for very good overflight rights. Well, we won't charge you that much. And half the Australians in the room thought it was a good deal, and the other half were like, who the hell are you talking to? And I do believe that if they take Taiwan, that will be their lake. And now we're seeing a new map, and that map now has Palawan. Look, China is, to me, a declining power, but it's not growing. It's losing people. I think the workforce decline, I know people are dying, but also people live longer, but the workforce decline is much more serious than what we're talking about. In other words, the number of people, the birth rates have been dropping consistently, but in the next, I'd say by 2030, once we get to 2030, I mean, we're going to start seeing 45 million people a year leave the workforce. Not going to die, but they're going to be leaving the workforce. And it's going to be huge. The inflationary pressures are going to be, in other words, they're going to have a mess. But that doesn't mean they're not going to have a military appetite, and it's not going to have an expansionist appetite. I firmly believe that I know the Filipinos believe this, and I know the Indonesians are starting to believe this. The Chinese have this racial superiority thing, the Han Chinese. You talk to these young Chinese guys who come out of Beijing, or even on some U.S. campuses, and they're not going to get their ass kicked by running their mouth too much, but they firmly believe. I've got a bit of an undercover son because my son's Chinese, and he and some of his friends listen to these guys, and these guys actually think that oh, the Filipinos will do what we tell them to do. Oh, they'll do this. Oh, they'll do that. I hate to say it, it's kind of like some of the extreme MAGA guys you get who are on the internet, and they're going oh, we'll take Canada in 3 days. Oh, yeah, we're going to, in other words, we're going to go over and start murdering people in Ontario to take land. I don't think so. But the thing is that I do believe that the Japanese, this is why the Japanese can't have it. I remember I was talking to, and since you said, I was talking to a very senior former diplomat, Reagan guy, and he was telling me it's no big deal if they go around Taiwan. In other words, he said, Mark, if shipping leaves to Japan, it has to go an extra 3 days. That's not much. And I was just looking at him going yeah, but what about all the stuff that comes up through there? Oh, don't worry. The Filipinos will everybody just goes around it. It's that's dream world. That's dream world. That's why I do not see the Japanese sitting there. I don't think the Koreans do anything because they got the land border, and they're the Koreans, what I'm saying? They would take them away. But I really do believe that the Japanese are not going to sit. And I will tell you the other group that I think, you want to arm them up, but you want to be careful is the Filipinos. I do think I do think if you give the Filipinos control of some HIMAR batteries down there, they're going to start popping those merchant ships off in about 5 seconds. It'd be like giving your 12-year-old a cannon, and he starts shooting squirrels with it. That's what the Filipinos will be like down there. The ethnic tensions between the Chinese community and the native Filipinos is growing. I think there's probably net negative migration out of the Philippines now because of that. They're certainly not coming anymore. But I firmly believe, and I'll defer to Steve on this, but I firmly believe the Japanese fight, because I just don't see, we have this belief, like Steve, I think is 100% right. I think the Chinese ships go out and sail out, and I think those systems fail in a half an hour. I just give you one analogy here. Is I was talking to a guy who works as a ship, and when they're building ships, you send in these guys from SGS or Veritas, and they as they're building the ship, you make sure the yard follows the specifications. He's in a yard where they're building his ships. He's their ship, and he walks over, and they're building these Chinese destroyers, and he said he would have rejected every single weld, every single crossbrace, every single everything. He said, if this thing hits 10-foot waves, it's cracking. And he said he saw at least 4 or 5 hulls like that. But he's very careful not saying that because I don't want to be accused of espionage. But he's out now. He's retired now. No, he's working in California now. But the fact of the matter is, it is that their equipment is that bad. And you hear these stories all over the place. And in the Philippines, they gave the Filipinos Chinese machine guns, personal assault weapons. And the Filipino army didn't want them because they were so bad. So Duterte had them turned over to the police department. And within about a year, they were none of them were working anymore. They were literally being carried around by, the local guard, the local security guards, which they buy them third hand. So anyway, but I defer to you and Steve because you guys understand it. I mean, I'm not a China expert because China is just too big of a subject for me. But when you sit there and you look at it and you talk to people and you go, the Japanese, or if the Chinese do something in the South China Sea, I don't think the Japanese will do too much. They'll offer some support. But I think if they come after Taiwan, I don't see how the Japanese sit. And I think they're making it as such. And Steve's right. I think Steve's 100% right. You wake that Japanese giant. Guys all know my boss, Jimmy. Jimmy's convinced that Abe changed. Before he went to jail, Jimmy was convinced that Abe changed Japan. He was convinced of it. He said just the feel of the whole country after Abe, he revitalized.
Well, Mark, I think that one of the things you were talking about is profoundly unknown and completely unappreciated among most of our global strategist clique, and that's the ethnic issues. Because we've only had one conversation about race in the world, and it's usually American bad or white man bad, but really this tension in Asia. So you have an aggressive CCP. The CCP plays the race card against a lot of people in the world, especially in Europe and especially in the United States and Canada. But there's this undercurrent of resentment in its near abroad is very palpable, and it's a very powerful force. And it is a limit on what people would call the soft power, because you have these arrogant people that ride their Ferraris around town, and take advantage of local who knows what. And they have this air of superiority about them. It goes down really, really badly. And so where they might have their way in Australia, where people wilt in the accusation of, you're just anti-Chinese, in Japan and the Philippines and Taiwan even to a degree, the ethnic card doesn't work the same way. But it is, and in some ways it wouldn't even be fair to call it ethnic. It's really attitudinal. It's like people of a big, nasty, snobby fraternity that the neighbors really have just grown to resent and borderline hate, and it's because of the way they act.
Steve, I think that's such an important point, but I also think it's run its course here too.
I hope so.
You know, it works. It works in their little world. You know, I mean, I'm working where I worked at, and when you show up, you know, sometimes we'd have people be there, and it was just so classic. And you guys were around Jimmy's dinner table, but imagine, you know, all of a sudden, you know, we have the professors or the lefties visiting from someplace show up, and Jimmy, the boss, we're talking about the Chinese, and they're like, oh well, you know, we have to respect their culture, and like you get our senior guys, they were like, F them, you know, the Hong Kong people had no patience for that. In fact, you know, it was an internet meme of catching mainland guys behaving badly. Now, it's kind of, and you're exactly right. Like if we just saw, we had 3 Chinese American soldiers arrested here in big news now for spying up in Washington, state of Washington. They just busted 3 guys there from the army selling secrets back to China. And what I didn't see, and I looked, is you didn't see, even on the lefty sites, you didn't see we have to make sure we have to stop Asian hate and those things. And the only people putting stop Asian hate signs are the people who have 5 other signs in their lawn. You know what I'm saying? In other words, why, you know, my favorite response to stop Asian hate is, I live in Asia. They hate each other. It is completely, you know, it's like there's that line about, there's that comedian, the big Fluffy, and he does his things about the Colombians hate the Cubans hate the Mexicans hate everybody, you know, and it's all the way through. And that's pretty much, that's a very good point, Steve. And it's something that if you brought up, I think 4 years ago, I think now about half the room would still gasp, but most people would be like, yeah, we're not playing that game anymore. You're not going to play that game. The people who really play that game are still the apologists. I saw it played, I guess it was about a month ago. 2 months ago, I was watching something from the Asia Society, and somebody brought it up, and the other person, the white person there, tried to play it. I'm not sure it played well.
Yeah. Well, part of it does seem, I guess, to other Asians like the greater East Asia co-prosperity fear, where Imperial Japan was saying, yes, we're going to kick out the European imperialists, and we're doing this on behalf of Asians. And then it turns out they're treating other Asians absolutely horrendously. But 2 thoughts came to mind. First, Mark, when you mentioned with Filipinos and giving a 12 gauge to a 12-year-old, which I loved in the State of the Union, or the non-State of the Union address, when they gave, was it a 13-year-old kid, the cancer survivor, and they gave him a badge to make him an honorary member of the Secret Service. The Democrats just sat on their hands during that. Wouldn't it have been awesome if he also gave the kid a service pistol, if he handed him, you know, a 6-hour 9mm, whatever the Secret Service is using today, you know, unloaded it all. But, you know, here's your badge, and here's your service pistol. I mean, imagine how awesome.
Hey, I got one question for Steve. Steve, I wanted to ask you your take on the Panama Canal sale. What's your take on that? How does that play for Trump? I mean, you see that as a real win for him, or what do you see, and the implications for China?
I think that there's still several acts in the Panama play to unfurl. First it was a big deal for that to be the first stop for a brand new Secretary of State. Who would have thunk that? And then to have that Secretary of State be a Marco Rubio who has some identity with the issues in the Western Hemisphere, but also branding on countering China's influence. And to have a takeaway from that visit, a commitment to actually exit the Belt and Road, not just say we don't like it, but actually go through the formalities of exiting the Belt and Road. That was kind of a really important planting of the flag that America is going to be present at a choke point in the North-South America corridor. It's a choke point on the migration flow also. And then when you're talking about running the ports, I am far too ignorant to understand how ports are run. It literally blows my mind how eagles' beaks and cow hooves and whatever else you can order on Amazon can go into a container and sort of plop show up on your doorstep in 2 days or less. And they somehow went into this morass of millions of containers, probably on jets for those fast moving shipments. But still, it just blows my mind that anybody's crap gets anywhere in this morass of containers. And Hong Kong, of course, is one of the bigger, busier ports in the world. But the Panama Canal throughput is huge. And I thought that at least symbolically and maybe substantively, it was a big win to call the bluff on, is a Hong Kong-based company independent or Chinese? To me, this is the first major, I think, global business news item where that was unequivocally answered. It's Chinese. And who did that? It was Beijing with the national security law. If you go before the national security law, there might have been enough gray zone activity. And I have friends that will go say, oh, this is a storied company, goes back generations, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, fine. But since the national security law, it's binary. And if you are legal and you operate there, you're Chinese. And you're not just ethnically Chinese, you're commie Chinese. And so is BlackRock better? I mean, they're probably tied in with a lot of things that might make people scratch their heads too. But it at least moved off the nickel that a Hong Kong company operating in good standing with the government of China is going to be the owner operator of the major port facilities there. Now, I don't know who BlackRock gets to operate these things. BlackRock is a financer.
The personnel won't change much at all, but the Chinese personnel will leave.
So I see this as a move generally in the right direction. I think it has to be sustained by the United States. I mean, I've spent some time this week in Argentina where there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of work that needs to be done to take advantage of that opportunity. But for most of my career, there's been a building brief in our government to warn about malign influences by China and to say, say no to Huawei and your sensitive comms and don't buy weapons platforms from China. I mean, even here in Argentina, there was a serious bid for Chinese fighter jets to be sold to Argentina. And they wanted F-16s, and they ended up getting the F-16s. But it was a serious competition. And who'd have thunk in our hemisphere, Chinese flying crap would be what people wanted to buy. But America's going to have to come in with our allies. Maybe those allies are where Christian is now in the United Arab Emirates, where they can afford to finance things. Maybe it's Japan taking a new look. They can't be present everywhere, but they can finance some things where you're looking at rare earths, you're looking at communication systems. And this Panama move is a part of that broader narrative. Is the United States and the responsible stakeholder West going to do something differently in this hemisphere? And if we do, I think the payoffs are enormous. And the safe shoring of supply chains become real. The immigration issues become very, very different. Food security, energy security, access to rare earths and other vital minerals. There's a lot we solve. We're a long way from it today, but these are just the incremental moves that haven't happened for 20 years of talk about, hey, watch out for China.
Right. And it's a lot of pressure going on Xi Jinping. And the 20% tariffs, which are just a start, the sort of political failures, what speaking here in the UAE with a Russian expert who focuses a lot on China, the continued purges in the rocket force in the PLA, the purges in the PLAN, China's Navy. There's something stirring there. And there's a lot of tension in that system. And Trump, I think, is going to do a lot to dial that up. And we're also sort of catching catching other currents, the problems in Taiwan with the LY cutting the defense budget at the same time the president wants to increase it, but trends in the Philippines and in Japan and elsewhere in the region that seem to be going our way. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of Domino Theory. Thank you, Steve Yates, as always, with great expertise on politics and everything from Washington to Asia and also in South America. Thank you to Mark Simon. We'll be back again with another episode soon.